I want you to think about the last time you voted. Maybe you were in a polling place. Maybe you filled out a mail ballot at your kitchen table. Either way, at some point you looked at a list of names and you made a choice. And in a democracy, that moment, that act of choosing, is supposed to be the whole point. The thing everything else is built around. But here's the question I want to sit with today, and it's the question that's going to anchor this entire series. Who decided what choices you were allowed to make? Not who you voted for. Who decided who was on the list? Because if we're being honest about how American elections actually work right now, the answer to that question is increasingly not you, not your neighbors, not your community. In race after race across state after state, the viable field, the candidates with the money to run real campaigns, to buy ads, to knock on doors, to be taken seriously, that field is being shaped before you ever set foot in a voting booth. Shaped by money. Shaped by a very small number of people with very large bank accounts and very specific agendas. Welcome to Ethos Trek. I'm Sarah, and this is the first episode of a series called Who Bought Your Ballot? A deep dive into one man's money, the races it's reshaping, and what it means for the most fundamental promise of democratic government, the consent of the governed. Over the next several episodes, we're going to follow that money from West Texas into the halls of the Texas Capitol, into a Senate race in Michigan, and into the architecture of how American elections get decided. We're going to name names, cite sources, and ask the questions that don't get asked often enough on the evening news. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start with what consent actually means. The Declaration of Independence makes a claim that is so familiar, most of us stopped hearing it a long time ago. Governments, it says, derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. That's not a talking point. It's not a bumper sticker. It's the philosophical foundation on which this entire democratic experiment is supposed to rest. And it raises a question that I think we've gotten sloppy about answering. What does consent actually require? Because consent isn't just the act of marking a ballot. Consent requires that the choice being offered is real. It requires that the person choosing has meaningful options, meaningful information, and that the menu they're choosing from hasn't been pre-filtered by someone with interests that are different from or actively opposed to their own. Think about it this way. If I hand you a restaurant menu that only has 3 items on it, you can choose between those 3 items. That's technically a choice. But if I had removed 40 other items before I handed it to you, items you might have preferred, items that better reflected what you actually wanted, can we really say you consented to what you got? You chose from what was available, but you didn't consent to the process that made that the available menu. That's what I want us to think about when we talk about money in elections. The question isn't just whether wealthy donors are allowed to spend money. That's a legal and constitutional debate I'm going to touch on in a moment. The question is what it does to the integrity of consent when one person or a very small group of people can spend enough money to determine which candidates are viable before a single primary vote is cast. At that point, voters aren't choosing their representatives. They're ratifying someone else's pre-selection. And ratifying someone else's pre-selection under duress of having no other viable option is not consent, not in any meaningful sense of that word. That's the framework I want you to carry through this entire series. Not left versus right, not Republican versus Democrat, consent versus pre-selection. That's the line we're examining, the legal mechanism. Now, very briefly, because this deserves its own full episode, and we're going to come back to it in detail in the series finale. I want to talk about how we got here legally. In 2010, the Supreme Court decided Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. The core holding was that political spending is a form of protected speech under the First Amendment, and that the government cannot restrict independent expenditures by corporations, associations, or individuals in connection with elections. What that means in practice is that there is no legal ceiling on how much money an individual can pour into an independent expenditure committee, a super PAC, to support or oppose candidates. They cannot legally coordinate directly with campaigns, but they can spend unlimited amounts to define the landscape those campaigns operate in. I want to be precise here, because precision matters. I'm not here to relitigate Citizens United as a legal matter today. Reasonable people have argued both sides of the constitutional question, and that's not the work of this particular episode. What I am here to do is show you what unlimited independent expenditures look like on the ground, what they look like in an actual primary race, what they look like when one person, one individual with specific ideology and a multi-billion-dollar network decides to use that legal framework to systematically reshape which candidates your state produces. Because when you see it in action, the consent problem becomes very concrete, very fast. That individual? His name is Timothy Marvin Dunn. He goes by Tim. He's from Big Spring, Texas, a small city about 40 miles east of Midland in the West Texas desert. He built his fortune in oil and gas, co-founding a company called Crown Quest Operating. In 2024, he sold Crown Rock, a related venture, to Occidental Petroleum for $12.5 billion. His personal share of that deal is estimated at around $2 billion. The Texas Tribune, which covers him more closely than any other outlet in the country, has called him the most effective political donor in Texas. Since the year 2000, he's put approximately $30 million into Texas campaigns and political action committees. He was the single largest individual source of campaign funds in Texas in both 2022 and 2023. He donated $5 million to Donald Trump's 2024 presidential campaign. He co-founded the America First Policy Institute, a think tank that has produced more than a dozen officials now serving in the Trump administration. Among them, Education Secretary Linda McMahon and EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin. He is a devout evangelical Christian, a lay pastor, and by the accounts of multiple independent researchers and journalists, a committed dominionist, someone who believes that Christians are called to exercise governance authority over civil institutions in accordance with biblical law. He has publicly rejected the label of Christian nationalist, writing in a 2024 op-ed that the term, quote, conflicts with biblical teaching, unquote. But his own words tell us quite a bit about how he sees the relationship between faith and government. At a 2022 political convention, Tim Dunn said this, "Government's job is to execute wrath on evil," unquote. And in 2010, according to former Texas House Speaker Joe Straus, the first Jewish Speaker of the Texas House since statehood, Dunn told him directly that only Christians should hold leadership positions in the lower chamber. Straus confirmed this on the record to the Texas Tribune. Dunn, has denied the remark. I want to be very clear that I am citing documented, sourced reporting here. The Texas Tribune, ProPublica, Rolling Stone, The Guardian, the FEC. I am not editorializing about Tim Dunn's faith. People of all faiths and no faith serve in public life, and that is exactly as it should be. What I am doing is documenting the stated worldview of a man who has spent $30 million and counting reshaping the landscape of Texas politics, and who is now spending at a national scale. Because this is where it connects to the consent question. Tim Dunn isn't simply donating to candidates he agrees with. That would be unremarkable. That's how political donations have always worked. What Tim Dunn has built is something qualitatively different. He has constructed an interlocking infrastructure of PACs, think tanks, media outlets, and advocacy organizations, all working together to determine which Republicans are ideologically pure enough to hold office, and to fund primary challenges against those who fall short. He doesn't just support candidates, he culls the field. He decides who survives to the general election, and he does it in race after race, district after district, with a consistency and a financial firepower that no ordinary voter, no collection of ordinary voters can match. When the most effective political donor in your state has a publicly stated conviction that government should execute wrath on evil and that certain religious groups shouldn't hold leadership positions, and that donor is systematically determining which candidates are viable in your elections, the consent question is not abstract. It is immediate. It is personal. And it belongs in every conversation about how democracy is functioning right now. Over the next several episodes, we're going to get specific. We're going to look at Dan Patrick, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, who has received $3 million in campaign cash and loans from Dunn-backed groups, and who presided as judge over the Texas Senate impeachment trial of a politician Dunn had invested heavily in protecting. We're going to look at Shelley Luther and what her story tells us about how this network rebuilds after scandal. We're going to look at a first-time candidate for the Texas Senate named Rhonda Ward and what her campaign reveals about the Dunn playbook spreading beyond Dunn himself. And we're going to look at Michigan, where Tim Dunn has put $5 million into a U.S. Senate race in a state he doesn't live in. Each episode in this series is designed to stand on its own. If this is your first time finding Ethos Trek, welcome. You have the full framework. If you're dropping in somewhere in the middle, each episode will open with a brief recap of where we've been. And every episode will close with something concrete you can do. Tools, resources, civic action. Because information without action is just anxiety. And that's not what we're here for. I want to come back to where we started. You walked into that voting booth. You looked at that list of names. You made a choice. The question this series is asking, the question every person in a democracy deserves to be able to answer, is whether the choice you made was really yours. Whether the menu you were handed reflected the will of your community, or whether it had already been filtered by someone with a very different set of priorities, a very large bank account, and no particular accountability to you or anyone you know. The consent of the governed is not a formality. It is not a ritual we perform every 2 or 4 years to maintain the appearance of self-governance. It is the condition that makes government legitimate. And when that condition is systematically undermined, legally, quietly, one primary race at a time, it is worth our attention. That's what Ethos Trek is for.